Okay, welcome everyone who's joining us either here in college or online. It's lovely to see you. It's wonderful to be back doing events in person, and also great to be doing an event with our neighbours at Clare College. So welcome to the new head of house and fellows and members of Clare. So just to make you aware, we are live streaming and recording this. We're taking questions at the end. There will be a roaming mic, so you will be recorded. And if you are watching live, then you can put your question in the chat on YouTube. So this is the first in our climate change series of events, and we're delighted to be joined by Trinity Hall alumna and Honorary Fellow Harriet Lamb. Harriet read English here at Trinity Hall from 1979 and was the Eric Lane Visiting Fellow at Clare College. So Harriet joined Ashton as CEO in May 2019 and was responsible for developing and implementing the new strategy to tackle climate change for the organisation. Prior to that, Harriet was CEO at peacebuilding organisation International Alert and spent 15 years leading fair trade both in the UK and internationally. And her second book, From Anger to Action, was published earlier in the summer.
Good plug, thank you.
And she is joined by our Trinity Hall Fellow, Dr. de-Wit, who is a Fellow in Psychology and Director of Studies in PBS, and also a University Associate Professor of Political Psychology. So I'll hand over to Lee and Harriet now to discuss creating change in the face of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shell. Warm welcome to Trinity Hall, Trinity Hall, sorry. I thought it might be nice, and particularly this is a lovely opportunity for me, in that actually one of my first engagements in politics was running around my hometown trying to persuade cafes to stock fair trade coffee, which I now realise, after having read your book, was part of a campaign that you had helped organise. And there's a quote from this that I wanted to pull out, where you say, "The truth we learn is that every issue, no matter how complex, can be made accessible." And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your thinking around that, the importance of making things accessible to people.
Yeah, well, I think that's at the heart, really, of being able to create social change, because actually every issue is quite complicated when you start getting into it. If we talk about climate change, you can get lost in the science. If you talk about the debts of developing countries, that's unbelievably complicated finance. But you can break anything down to its absolute bare essentials so that people can be engaged. And I do think that was absolutely the joy of fair trade in particular, because obviously it was really fun to bribe people with chocolate. Then there was fair trade wine, there were flowers. People loved getting dressed up as a fair trade banana and prancing around the high street to raise awareness. And I've also always believed that campaigning and social action should be fun. I don't think you should wander around sort of crying all the time about the problems of the world. So I think that was a real gift within fair trade, both that it was accessible and fun, and that critically it was something every single person can make a difference with. It really, really shifted the dial when people like you in your youth were going around asking shops to stock fair trade, or students were asking Trinity Hall to have fair trade tea and coffee, and people did do it, and they responded, and then you feel empowered, and you go to the next thing, and you write to the supermarket boss, and the next thing, and the next thing, and that was undoubtedly what helped bring fair trade onto our shop shelves throughout the country, and was a just really inspiring lesson about how you can make any issue accessible and fun.
Very inspiring. And it was also fair trade that led you actually into concerns about climate change, was working with farmers and their daily life confrontation with climate change that led you to be concerned about climate change. I think you could talk a little bit about some of those intersections and how climate change intersects with so many other problems.
Yeah, I guess like many people, I was originally a climate change denier. My mother always used to talk about how when she was young, she could skate on the rivers in Somerset. And I used to think, oh, ridiculous. Of course, she's exaggerating. How could the world have got hotter? And then the people who really brought it home to me about how the climate was changing were first actually coffee farmers in Tanzania who I first met. And they were old guys who were part of the cooperatives that were founded after independence, wizened old men with no teeth, and they're on their fields, so committed to the principles of working together as smallholder farmers. And I was just chatting to them in their dusty fields, and they started saying, when it rains, it should be sunny, and then it's sunny when it should be raining, and I just can't farm anymore in the way my father farmed, in the way my grandfather farmed. And it just seemed really strange. And I remember that really sort of thinking, how can that be? Or why would that be? Why would the weather be changing? And then going back and hearing more and more of these stories from other farmers. And then, of course, hearing increasing incidents from fair trade farmers of coping with catastrophes. That, of course, they've always been hurricanes sweeping through the Windward Islands and knocking down all the banana trees. But they had become more frequent and they had become more violent. And we would hear that coffee farmers in Nicaragua had had their whole villages washed away, or farmers in Uganda had had mudslides and people, and it just kept building up and building up. And then for me, it was actually Al Gore's film that the penny finally dropped, ka-ching, about what exactly was happening to the world. The crisis in the climate that we were creating, and that therefore we had to do something to help solve it.
And so your book is massively reflecting on the role of civil society in lots of different domains, trying to address problems with the climate, problems with inequality, problems with conflict around the world. In terms of how civil society engages with the climate issue, probably what's most familiar to most people are protests like XR and the Insulate Britain protests. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you see those fitting, but maybe a bit broader history of the sort of engagement of civil society in the climate crisis.
They're really interesting. Well, it might be nice to ask the audience first, a quick straw poll. Put your hand up if you support XR and all that they are doing. Put your hand. So for those who are online, I can tell you we've got a possible, we've got a one definite. Okay, put your hand up if you worry about the tactics. You don't agree with the tactics. You disagree. Oh, quite a lot of hands going up. And some abstentions, I feel there's some abstentions in there. Because it is quite complicated, isn't it? And I think if you look at the climate movement as a whole now, it's incredibly strong overall, actually. And often civil society and social movements are characterised as, it's David going up against Goliath. And I actually think with the climate movement now, it's Goliath up against Goliath. And we are slugging it out to the bitter end, really. So it's absolutely Goliath is there, and the fossil fuel companies and the governments that they've won round through their lobbying are going to fight and fight not to have to make the changes and not to stop coal. But on the other hand, I think the movement for climate is really quite strong now. And of course, actually, when I was here doing my Harriet Lamb Fellowship, was a complete gift from Clare College, was when the school strikers were really taking to the streets, and it was such fun. I joined them, actually, walking through Cambridge. Well, I stood at the back, so I wasn't pretending to be. And I have to say, immediately you could see, wow, the passion and the energy of the young people, and their placards that basically were saying, well, if you, the adults, aren't going to do this, we're going to have to. And if you look at what the school strikers did, combined with David Attenborough, of course, another Clare connection there, and his films, combined with XR, I would say it was the three of them did shift the debate. It absolutely shifted climate from being, it was a big issue sometimes, and then it got completely swept aside by the rise of austerity and the crisis, and it had just gone way down the agenda. And I think all credit to those three groups who together transformed it. And the whole thinking within XR, they're incredibly thoughtful, well thought out policies, whether or not you agree with them, is that democracy isn't working, that democracy isn't taking on the most serious issue of our time, the existential threat to biodiversity and the climate. And if it's not working, it is legitimate at that point to break the law to change that debate. And the history of that sort of whole non-violent direct action, I mean, that has long roots back to people like, well, very far back, but also people like Gandhi, obviously, or Martin Luther King, people who really felt you find the thing, there comes a point when the moral authority of the law is superseded by a greater moral authority, that your values come from another moral authority. And if you were, for an example would be, if you were involved in a genocide and someone said you've got to kill someone else, well, whatever the law said you had to do it, you wouldn't do it. You'd say, no, I answer to a greater moral authority. I shouldn't kill someone. And in the same way, people say, no, I won't respect that that's white only because I answer to a greater authority that recognises all people as equal, and therefore I will break the law and sit in a white only part of the bus. Or case after case where people have actually managed to shift debates and change society by being prepared to break the law. And that's what Extinction Rebellion are doing. And whether you always agree with each of their individual tactics, you can't deny the extent to which they've shifted the debates. I mean, I don't know, you do a lot of polling, Lee. I mean, what do you feel the public mood is about Extinction Rebellion?
Yeah, I think you're right about that shift after some of the early protests, particularly after in 2019, YouGov did some polling after some of the large Extinction Rebellion protests, and concern for climate just shot up on the radar. I think also it was a combination of David Attenborough speaking out against it. I think now the public mood, at least in terms of the polling data, seems to have be less favourable towards the specific actions that XR are taking, but it might not be their aim to sort of win over public opinion if they're sort of still keeping climate change on the agenda. So, like you say, I think they do have a thought through strategy, and, credit to them for engaging proactively in, what is a democratic dilemma as to how we get action when our governments don't seem to be taking that action. Although very interestingly, in the run-up to COP, we've been doing some polling around attitudes towards the willingness of the extent to which people want governments to take action in the run-up to COP. And it's interesting, some other surveys YouGov have done and that we have done, if you ask people, do you think you should do more to tackle climate change? Around 50-60% of people will say, yes, I think I should do more to tackle climate change. If you ask them, should your government do more? That goes up by another 10 or 20%. So, 50-60% say their government should do more. We did some polling saying, should all governments do more at COP26? And there the support was overwhelming, sort of above 90% of people. The only country where we saw less support was the US, but even there it was 76% of the population thought all governments should do more. And this is a promising opportunity for COP then, because it sort of offers this potential to navigate these questions of, why should we do this when China is still emitting so much? But if there's a sense of consensus at COP, then there is this huge opportunity. But it does seem like that opportunity exists a lot in the abstract, and there's this sort of abstract willingness for more action on climate change. But then when it comes to specific changes to people's lives, like the introduction of a low traffic neighbourhood, or here in Cambridge we've had a lot of debates about the closing of Mill Road Bridge, when it comes to infringing on people's lives, then often you can come up against more opposition. And I know this is something you work on a lot with Ashton, so I wonder if you could tell us about how you sort of try and promote the wider benefits of tackling climate change.
Yes, but first I want to slightly disagree because I actually think so many people are making so many changes all the time already. We've seen the explosion of veganism, for example. That's completely transformed in quite a short number of years. The availability of vegan food and what is seen as acceptable, that, do you always have to offer meat or whatever? And I think that's one of the shifts. We've seen a huge rise in people saying they don't want plastic, they don't want single-use plastic, they're not going to do it, they want to go to refill things or use things that don't come in plastic. We've seen an explosion in local food markets. So I think there's place after place where we have seen changes, and in particular when it's made more possible for people by the institutions with which they're involved, whether it's their school or their college or the government. So the more cycle lanes there are, the more people bicycle. Although, actually, just to share with you, I did actually have a bicycle accident yesterday. It's rather sad. I am a lifelong cycling enthusiast. In fact, I can't even drive. I can't drive, and Lee, you never fly, don't you? So
I can't drive either.
You can't drive either. Well, there you go. So my life cycling. And yesterday I got hit in a cycle lane, worst of all, by a cycle rickshaw. So never mind. But the more there are cycle lanes, the more people will feel that they can cycle. So obviously we need both individuals taking action and the enabling environment so people can make a difference. And I think in the work we've been doing at Ashton, the key is, though, that you do involve people in those decisions, and often that you start with people's own priorities. And for most people, most of the time, the top priority is not the climate. The top priority is getting their kids fed. How am I going to do this? How am I going to pay my heating bills? How am I going to get through the next week? And often having to make choices, actually, between heating and eating. And in that case, it's presenting what may be a benefit for the climate. But, for example, if homes are insulated, you have a warmer, cosier home, you have lower fuel bills, and it's good for the climate. So always starting with the other benefits that are closer to people's hearts. Or again, on closing roads, it's starting with the fact that so many children nowadays have asthma, shocking rates of asthma, that everyone's worried about their children having asthma. So if you present it as being about cleaner air and better health, both because you get rid of some of the pollution and because by walking or cycling you're getting more exercise, and that's helping tackle the obesity crisis. So if you present it in those ways, people are more inclined to come with you than if you always present it as being about the climate, which people do care about, they really do, but it's not the top of their list because they've got so many pressing priorities. And I think that's also why we believe so strongly that, and actually this is one of the key arguments both myself and my co-author Ben Jackson make in the book, is that we have to address the big issues together. And in particular, looking at, for example, the climate, we need also to look at tackling inequality. And because otherwise, it just looks like yet again, people at the bottom of the social pile are going to have to pay the price for the shifts, while those who've gained already won't have to make those changes. So it's making sure you look at the benefits for people, and of which one of the big things is jobs. And so we work, for example, at Ashton with a brilliant organisation called Repowering. They're based in Brixton, and they were actually the first community energy group to put solar panels on social housing, on the big council blocks in Brixton. But they didn't just do that. What they did was they worked with young people on the estate. So the young people got training in how do solar panels work, how do you install them, how do you care for them, and they got a proper paid apprenticeship to do that, so that they could then go on and get a job in that sector if they'd like to. And then, I should say, Repowering are the most brilliant group. They're absolutely full of energy. So having done that, they kind of then thought that's a problem, because once the panels are up on the top of social housing, you never see them. So the goal of helping raise awareness goes. So then they thought, okay, well, what we'll have to do is we'll put solar panels and create gardens in all the land that runs alongside railway tracks. There's so much wasted land along the railway tracks. We'll have little gardens with solar panels, and people from estates, which are often on food deserts where there's no fresh food to be had for love nor money, can grow their own veg, and it will have all these multiple benefits. So they started doing these energy gardens that are now springing up all over London and will spread across the country soon. And then their next idea was, we'll grow, they've got bees for honey, and then they've got hops to make beer. And I'm really sorry, I should have brought with me one of their energy garden ale, which they then make from their own hops using their solar energy. It's really fantastic, but you do have to put it in the fridge because otherwise it does fizz over a bit. But I think that's a kind of good metaphor of there, because they're just so full of the next thing that they can do, but all focused around building community as well as tackling climate. Never just about the one, always about both.
And it's a really interesting point you make about people making the changes when those changes become accessible or available in people's environments. And there's an extent there to which, the individual can kind of only do so much if, the context in which they're living doesn't support cycling or making pro-environmental choices. And maybe focusing more here on the UK first, we might move on to COP. But our government likes making pledges on climate change and likes making commitments to the long term, where we're going to get in terms of tackling climate change. But there's, I think, widespread frustration about the lack of concrete action, implementable plans. And I wonder if you could talk about how civil society might help hold government to account to make sure there really are the changes to our sort of lived environment that do make those pro-environmental choices easier to make.
Yeah, well, I think that's really right, that the government actually comes out with some quite good targets and some quite good statements, but where it's the detail. Where's the detail? And it's the detailed plan coming right down to the level of each of our communities that will help make the difference. And I think that's what's often lacking and really frustrating for people, you've got those ambitious targets, but they need to come all the way down. And I think, somewhat hilariously, given my bicycle accident yesterday, we describe in the book civil society as being like one of those electric cargo bikes, a bit like a rickshaw. The front wheel for civil society are your values, and your values are what keep you going straight despite all the bumps. You have to always keep your focus on what are your values, what do you want to achieve. And then you have the two back wheels, and one of the back wheels is about protest, what we were discussing. It's about XR, it's about the school strikers, it's about people who shift the dial by protesting. And the other wheel has to always be people who are helping create the living alternative, who are showing how it can be different and creating that vision that helps people think how we can get there. And you always have to have both. And what both do, I think, is create change in and of themselves, but also give a mandate to governments. Because we also have to, as civil society, create the space where it becomes desirable for governments to act on social justice or on fostering peace building or on tackling the climate. So one example would be what we're doing at Ashton. We run this fantastic campaign called Let's Go Zero 2030. And the idea is that schools commit, they put their hand up to say, well, we'll be zero carbon by 2030. And I should say we went for zero carbon, not net, because there's a lot of net carboning going on. Everyone's committing to net, but what are they going to do with the netting? There is no solution. There's this sort of idea, there's some magic way, they'll plant a few trees and they'll have netted off all the carbon they haven't got rid of. So we say it's got to be zero carbon, and we say 2030 because 2050 is too late. 2050 is just too late. We have got to take this radical action by 2030. So we're saying it's a campaign for schools to become zero carbon by 2030. So schools sign up and they say, right, we'll do everything we can on what we've laid out, the 8 pillars: curriculum, water, waste, recycling, how I get to school, energy, buildings, etc. And with a pathway for each, as you say, making it easy, making it accessible. But they can't possibly do that without government resources. Any of you involved with schools will know that they're short of money to pay teachers, let alone to improve school buildings. So at that point, we're both saying that children and teachers will play their part, and creating that demand and that mandate so government can, and will, we hope, come in and put the billions down that it needs for those schools to be completely retrofitted. And I think civil society is always like that. You've got that interplay between what we can do and the space we create and the push we give for policymakers as well.
And of course, we have this unique opportunity at the moment in that we are hosting COP26 very soon. I was wondering if you could reflect more specifically on how civil society might best create the space for politicians to take the decisions that we hope they're going to take.
Well, the truth to tell, it's all looking a bit scary at the minute. I mean, it's a week to go. It's a week to go, and the headlines are not good. The latest was Russia not coming. Maybe President of China doesn't come. Maybe India doesn't come. I mean, it's not looking good. in terms of the importance of having all the world leaders there, of having all countries there, to your earlier point. That's the heart of COP. And it's not looking good in terms of people's commitments. It doesn't anywhere near add up to enough what people have already voluntarily said they will do and that they will do more of. What's called the sort of ratchet mechanism, where they're meant to come in and say, well, we're going to do this much more and this much more. We are just way off, and that's why the big campaign is to keep 1.5 alive, because there's a sense we're slipping away from the target of keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. And there's just a sense we're not going to make it. So you sort of feel we have to go on with the positive message, with the calls for the change we all know it needs, including actually from wealthy countries. That means putting down on the table the 100 billion a year that was promised to poor countries to help them adapt to climate change and mitigate. That was kind of part of the deal, because developing countries obviously felt, well, hang on, this isn't fair. You lot have caused all the problems, and we're dealing with climate change, and yet we haven't got the resources to deal with it, and we have millions of people who don't yet have access to electricity. So a deal was done where it was 100 billion a year promised to developing countries, which is still not appeared. And that we've got a week to go now, and this is after years. That was at Copenhagen. This is years later, so it becomes a trust thing, because otherwise the poorer countries just feel, well, why should we trust you, rich nations, if you're not going to shift? So I think we have to all keep on pushing, just as civil society did help with getting the deal done in Paris. It was about helping create that atmosphere within which world leaders felt they had to do a deal. And then we have to go on pushing in every aspect of our everyday lives. Because whatever happens at COP, the day after COP, we've all got to do more on the climate, whether it's in our colleges or where we work, where we go, the way we shop, or how we live our lives, and the institutions that we can help shift. Always, I think that's the key, always, isn't it? Thinking, where can we make the biggest shifts? And I think it's really significant that recently Cambridge did agree to divest out of fossil fuels. I mean, hooray, congratulations, really. And there's been a huge campaign on divestment as a whole. That definitely matters. People shifting their money out of fossil fuels and hopefully into positives like renewables. Those are it's really working out where we should all do the little things, and then we should think, where can we get the biggest impact?
Mm. And given that we are talking in a university context, I wonder if you could, my final question, maybe end on what universities can go doing forward. There's the sort of divestment aspect that lots of colleges have taken, the university has taken. And I think that, just to broaden this question out, I mean, one of the things I find interesting in the book is you talk about how other civic institutions, like maybe churches or unions, have maybe sort of deteriorated in their membership over the years. So some of the sort of bedrocks of how civil society organises and engages with problems in the current day have fallen to the wayside a little bit. And universities strike me as one civic institution that we've got that has some role to play in shaping society. And I wonder if you could say some things about what you see that role as being and how particularly universities can engage with the climate crisis. And feel free to, provoke us if that's stocking more fair trade coffee in your bedroom. Or
exactly. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a gift, actually, you've got being in a university town, is the ability to help build those sense of communities where people come together on a regular basis to think about these issues, where you have people going to chapels and going to churches and being members of societies and going along to different kinds of groups. And because that's where we need to help build that sense of what's the future community look like, and how can we build a more regenerative economy instead of one that's just about take, make, and throw away. We want to get to this much more circular way of running our economies and our societies, where things are valued and used and reused. So I think having debates, I think, well, credit to Shell, congratulations on putting on the climate change series, and I think there are 4 more to come, or 3 more. 4 more to come, which is fantastic, because so much of it always, doesn't it, starts with discussing and debating, and actually that's what things like trade unions and being members of political parties, which in general has gone down, were brilliant at, because people learned that of going in and arguing and debating with people who have very different views, and think that helps you think things through. And that's what we've lost. So again, that's what I think the university and colleges can do so much to help nurture, and to nurture that sense that we all as individuals, and particularly students going out in the world, really have the ability to make the difference, and actually have a responsibility to make the difference, that we all hold that responsibility for other people, and particularly at the bottom of the pile in society, both in our own country and internationally, and for the planet. And so thinking together about what are the things that we can do is always the best way, because otherwise you can end up thinking of the same old things, and it can almost become too easy. It's not true, it's always really complicated and really difficult, but there might be whole new things none of us have thought of before, which would be so great when you get that time to discuss ideas, as well as thinking through, well, what are we doing about our food, and is it sustainably sourced, locally sourced? Are we buying from local growers? Is it indeed fair trade? What are we doing about transport? What are we doing? And really tracking, in every case, the carbon footprint of all of us and how we can reduce it. But it's not all about pain. I think going back to your question about low traffic neighbourhoods have run into huge problems all over the country because people feel something's been taken away from them. And it's thinking about what's the gain. It's all the time thinking about what can we do that would make our lives more rich, actually, and that would help the planet. And so I think that's also, it'd be really great to hear from the audience, actually. What are your bright ideas about what you think you could do, or the college could do, or that you're doing already? It would be really lovely to hear from, perhaps everybody could share something. Is there some person who's going to go first, or I'm going to have to pick on Loretta? Oh, yes, I'm going to have to pick on you, Loretta. Go on, why don't you kick us off? And then I don't know if the people online can pop it in the chat, then Shell's going to read out. So we'd love to hear from you online as well. What are you doing already, and what would you like to do more of, but just haven't quite worked out how yet? Or what do you think a university should do?
So I wanted to pick up, actually, it's so interesting to hear you talking about the run-up to COP now. I was very heavily involved in the run-up to the Paris climate negotiations when I was running Christian Aid. And we were pleaded with, actually, by people I won't name, but to mobilise the faith communities and to try and, Christian Aid is a Protestant development agency, to try and make sure the Pope came out with the right thing, which I thought was hilarious, to put us in charge of that particular thing. But everyone knew he was coming out with this encyclical, which turned out to be so influential in the run-up to the Paris negotiations. And the Paris diplomatic effort ahead of the conference was just so huge. And I just haven't seen the same machinery be put in place here to pave the way for years in advance of these very, very important meetings. But what we were asked to do was try and mobilise the faith communities. And with development agencies around the world, we got 1.5 million signatures, which they then asked us to present to the French president to take into the negotiations, and they felt that this would be very material. So I'm quite interested in what you see the faith communities doing now on those civil society agencies in the run-up to COP, and whether you, either of you believe that they are still having an influence. I mean, some of the politicians involved who begged us for these things cried when the petition was presented because they thought it was genuinely affecting. So I'm interested in that. The other thing that I'd be really interested to hear you comment on is the role of the institutional investor, having been overseeing the Church of England's endowment portfolio for the last 4 years. I've seen how institutional investors can take a message to the biggest companies and get them to change. and if they don't change, can take action to change them. And that the institutional investors becoming more muscular, both divesting and engaging, as well as investing in sustainables. So that just any comment you'd like to offer on that, I'd be really interested. And I'd actually like to see the pressure on institutional investors and the encouragement to institutional investors to continue, but not just to walk away all the time, but actually to use investor muscle to change what the companies are doing.
I'm sure you cheated there and asked us a question instead of saying what you if not to. I think it's really interesting. There's no question the faith community is mobilising globally around we have to get a good deal in COP. And particularly, obviously, because the faith community is so strong across Africa and Latin America and pushing really hard. And the Pope, although I think the Pope is not going, I've heard, to Glasgow, but that he has been bringing out these absolutely influential public statements, but also behind the scenes talking with the fossil fuel companies about how they just have to shift and doing that behind the scenes diplomacy. But I would say the baton might have been passed on, and I would say, interestingly, you've also got the business and the finance community stepping up ahead of governments. Now, obviously, it's not the whole business and finance community, would that it was, but the leaders within those movements, there's a whole thing called Race to Zero, trying to get businesses to commit. So that whatever happens at COP, you've got other people doing these big shifts and saying, right, well, we're going to be climate positive by 2030. We're going to be net zero by 2050. I mean, making commitments and starting to put in place the building blocks. So I think you definitely see that. And you also definitely see a movement within the finance sector to really think because there's been some brilliant work done. And actually we talk about that in the book by an organisation called Carbon Tracker, who actually decided how can we shift the markets, and they came up with this brilliant idea of the carbon bubble, and the idea that it's like a bubble, and the bubble will burst, and then all the money you've invested in fossil fuels will be stranded. There'll be what's called stranded assets, and you will have lost your money. So putting down the straight economic argument to the economic people. So saying to the bankers, the risks you're taking with fossil fuels are so huge. If I was you, I'd pull out. And that's been really influential. It's amazing. I mean, for an academic institution, the power of ideas and how once you land that idea within the business world, how it just has flown actually in terms of its impact. And all of us are somehow involved with institutional investors. If you have a pension, or of course, if you're part of a university, the university has funds that are invested. And there are so many other ways that we need to try to shift the finance so that the finance shifts the companies. But yes, it's all a long haul. But yes, sir.
Just wanted to share my own point of view. I'm a technologist, a physicist. And the big secret is that we actually have the technology and the know-how today to actually solve these problems, right? So recently we launched a strategy around zero carbon X. Okay, so what is X? X is anything. Cement industry, the glass industry, the desalinated water industry, supply chain, cities. It is actually quite possible. The technology exists today, but there's a lack of government policy, willingness, the business models, incentives to make it happen. So the technology exists, but the willingness is light on the ground. And the concept that I like to, I'm sure you know, and you mentioned the key word, circularity, the circular carbon economy, that teaches us that actually we have to stop thinking of carbon as a problem, but think of carbon, so carbon is not our enemy. Think of it as a friend. So there's a word that's used often, what we call, there's good carbon and bad carbon, right? The bad carbon is we have to treat it as a friend, and we call it a fugitive carbon. And how do we recycle, reuse it, remove it? And the technologies exist today to do that, right? And we often hear the word green hydrogen, right? And that's a great technology. It's mature. It's growing in popularity. But again, where is the supply and demand? Who will invest? So the investment side of the equation is really, really very, very. It's still not being addressed properly.
Yeah.
So and the other big thing, of course, is the other big secret is food. Agriculture is a huge, and nobody ever talks about agriculture, is a huge consumer of carbon, right? But nobody ever, we never talk about it.
Now, it's very good timing, this meeting today, because it was only 2 days ago the government brought out their enormous net zero strategy and their heating and housing strategy, and the whole sort of climate movement went quiet for a day while everyone was desperately trying. It was so enormous and covering so many things. And in these 368 pages, food wasn't there. Food, it was absolutely a missing in action. And because then behind food lies agriculture, and there's such a huge movement to say we've got to move to more generative ways of growing our food, and that it was very strange that food wasn't in there. And I actually couldn't agree with you more. We have all the things we need to reach zero carbon. We don't need to invent anything new, and there's definitely too much in that strategy about carbon capture and storage, and we'll have this invention and that invention, and we just don't need to make things more complicated and invest in more or dream up these future fantasies that are going to rescue us. We have all the solutions within our hands that actually will help us probably live better, happier lives, in fact, so that, and would address inequality. And I think that was again lacking, that sense of the government being really ready to have that wholesale systemic view about how you shift the whole of an economy and the whole of a society, which actually would include, going back to Loretta's point about, when we think about institutional investors, and this, in a way, huge interest in everyone's investing. The latest trend is ESG. I don't know if you've all heard about ESG. We always used to say that CSR plus HR equals PR. And I think it's a bit the same with ESG. ESG plus KPIs, they love these three acronyms. ESG plus KPIs plus HR definitely equals PR. And everybody's doing ESG. Oh my God, but where are those trillions? Where are those trillions of dollars that are allegedly invested in green solutions? Because I can tell you, I know all the organizations across the world looking for funds to scale, because they do have the solution and they have the business model, but they need the finance, and they need the finance on more concessional terms, probably, than people can get for sure, in fossil fuels. So we absolutely also need stricter regulations, including of the financial institutions. But I don't know, what do you think? Sorry, Lee, I was twittering on.
Yeah, very interesting. It's interesting, YouGov put out some data recently suggesting that one of the most persuasive arguments for the British public for us to transition faster with climate change is that the change to our economy is inevitable, and it will give us an economic advantage in the longer term if we get there first. So sort of interesting sense of sort of British pragmatism about, how and why to get there. I think interesting point about the religious communities. I mean, I think having, the more, trusted messengers engage with people that you can have, I think the better and the more persuasive that will be. I see there's a question from the audience. Yeah.
And then I think Shell wants to bring some in from the...
Hi, I don't know a lot about what you do, so forgive me for that, but I do know quite a lot about politics, having worked in newspapers and for BBC News and various other disreputable places. And one of the things that I don't understand is your analysis. I mean, in 2019, this wasn't even an electoral issue. I mean, the issue was people up north mainly feeling they'd been neglected, and they wanted people to invest in their communities. It's the push isn't coming from that on the Johnson government. It owes more to Carrie Johnson, I'd suggest, and Zach Goldsmith. It's not actually coming from the voters as such. And it's leading, in my view, to a malfunction of democracy. I mean, what you're getting is some absurd knee-jerk reactions, like heat exchangers. I mean, when the freezing fog's coming off the cam, I can tell you a heat exchanger is not going to keep you warm here if you've got nothing else. And the car legislation is bizarre. I mean, why didn't they go to the car manufacturers and say, here, you know about engine technology, make sure that you are reducing emissions year on year to a certain year. And it doesn't matter which technology you use, whatever, hydrogen, whatever. Instead, they've said, well, you can't buy anything but an electric car after 2030. I mean, believe you me, this will not go down well. And I think actually the problem that you're going to come across is certainly by 2030, you're going to get a kind of counter-reformation. I mean, it is going to so piss off the voters, the whole thing will start going into reverse. And that's what the newspapers are talking about at the moment. So I don't recognise your analysis from a political point of view.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you're right that it wasn't a big election issue in 2019, but I do think that people have moved.
Or in any other election, for that matter. There's only one Green MP.
There is, but I do think the Green Agenda has moved significantly within the general population. And the data does show that the public opinion has moved on climate. And you do see in other countries that it is a very big electoral issue. In Germany, where they have a different electoral system, you know, huge number of Green representatives elected. But I do take your point about the you know, perhaps the lack of engagement with some of the industries and how some of these solutions are going to be constructed and how that might lead to a backlash amongst some sectors of the population. I mean, I think you would argue as well that governments need to work constructively within industries to find solutions pragmatically and to work with a range of stakeholders. We've talked about the role of citizens' assemblies and how you actually bring people together and talk to people about what solutions they find acceptable in their daily lives. And I think there's a big role for that in identifying the solutions that are going to be acceptable going forward.
No, I think that's right. I think that's really interesting because I think democracy goes beyond just a general election where there's a particular way they're fought out, particularly in this country. But there's no question that all the polling shows the public want governments to move on this and they want them to move fast. And I think it is really interesting if you then take that and say, well, how are we going to do it? How are we going to reach zero carbon? And that's where I think these experiments in new ways of having consultation with people is really interesting. And it's methodologies that have been taken from the continent, actually, in quite a lot of cases, of bringing a cross-section of people together and arguing out what could the solutions be. And when the Assembly came together in Parliament, it didn't have legislative authority, which is what XR believes they should have, but it had consultative authority, if you like. And, I mean, their solutions were far more radical than anyone expected them to be. They were very clear that we should do things like limit flying and that we could... there were lots of really good, strong policies coming out by giving people the space to come together and argue it out. And so more and more local authorities have done the same, that having declared a climate emergency, they've then brought people together to help them work out because there are difficult changes. Every time you close a road, somebody else is upset in a neighbouring road. So coming together to discuss, is that the right thing to do or not, I think is really, I think that's one of the exciting things actually to come out of this movement. And was very interesting, and you saw the same techniques being used, for example, in Ireland with the big debates there, including around abortion. We've seen and as well as in Northern Ireland, you've seen that in different places to tackle these really difficult issues. I think it is a great idea to bring people together.
I'll give you one very simple example. Cheshire and Amersham. Okay, so they were... One of the reasons the Tories lost that was they had loosened planning regs, so a lot of house building. What have they done with loosening house planning on house building? Given it to Michael Gove, it's gone straight in the bin. And I would suggest when people's energy bills go up, which they will certainly sure as hell do in April, this is going to go into reverse for you. That's what's going to happen.
Well,
Tories are very
I actually don't agree. I think if we tackled the shift away from gas a decade ago, we'd have never got into this problem that we're in now. If we'd increased still further our dependency on renewables, we wouldn't have the squeeze. And it's not only a squeeze on the actual gas, actually the squeeze is on the skill shortages. We don't have people to drive the lorries. And it's a bit the same problem. Going back to needing a more systemic shift, we need to be training up the people to have the skills to build the future green economy, because that's where people will have jobs, and that absolutely is what helps decide elections, is when people have jobs. But I would love to go on debating, but I want to bring in some people online who are...
Brilliant, thank you. So a question from one of our online viewers saying, thank you, Harriet. Really interested to consider the importance of diversity and equality being linked with the climate change debate, so that it doesn't feel like a choice only for the well-off. I'm not sure that I've heard that articulated so clearly in the media. Harriet, do you think the government is focusing on this message?
On diversity, equity and inclusion within the climate? Well, at one level they are, to the last questioner, because they are looking at it within the levelling up agenda. I mean, and they have sought within the net zero document that comes out, that is part of what it plays. And actually they talk a lot in that document about the jobs that will be generated and in different parts of the country. And the absolute critical importance that the transition is a just transition, and that it's not one that leaves behind those who have been left behind in previous traditions, such as when we closed down the coal mines. And those coal villages are still incredibly desolate places, frankly, because there wasn't the attention made to enabling people to make that shift. So I think the shift in the climate debate comes together with the government's levelling up agenda, where they absolutely want to see places like the Northeast have some of the regeneration of the future economy. So in a way, it could play in very well. And I think bringing that, that people see more climate action could lead to future jobs, I think is really important to helping win support for it. There's another side of the debate that I also think the environmental movement as a whole is not diverse and inclusive enough. It is a very middle-class white movement. And that's also a very big debate within XR about what can we do to try and overcome that. And they've worked really hard to say, well, how do we bring in different communities? And I think the combination of XR, of people really saying we need to give voice to people like Indigenous communities who are in the front line of the climate crisis as it's hitting now, and Black Lives Matter exploding 2 years ago now, isn't it? I think that's been very good for the environmental movement, to have to really think about how do we make sure that in everything we do, we are more representative of the country as a whole, and we're thinking all the time of those solutions that will benefit people immediately, such as tackling fuel poverty, as well as benefiting the climate.
I think it's gone 7, so I think we might need to wrap up there.
Brilliant. Well, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you both, Lee and Harriet. Thank you to everyone joining both in the room and online. As Harriet says, we have 4 more events coming up, so if you check out our website for the details. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again to Lee and Harriet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.